Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. As locust attack have started spreading all around the world, people have become curious to know what Islam says about the locusts. Has Allah mentioned anything about locust in the Quran or not? The answer is yes. Allah says in the Quran in Surah Araf chapter 7 verse 133 that so we sent upon them the flood and locusts and lice and frog and blood as distinct signs, but they were arrogant and were criminal people. Who is Allah referring to? Who is Allah talking about in this verse? There is one more place in the Quran where Allah has mentioned locusts. Allah says in Surah Qamar, chapter 54, verse 7 that they will emerge from the grave as if they were locusts spreading. Why locusts? Why Allah didn't mention something else here? Before discussing these two verses, let's learn something about locusts. What is locust? Locust is an insect quite similar to grasshopper and cricket. In fact, these all three insects are from the same family. But as compared to grasshopper and cricket, locusts have a unique ability. It can exist in two different forms or say in two phases. What are those phases? So locusts are generally found in desert regions, mostly from northwest Africa to western Asia. Typically they spend most of their time alone and this phase is called their solitary phase. But when the weather starts to change and the environmental conditions starts to shift, they start transforming into a different form, which is called their gregarious phase. For example, when the dry area where they are living in starts to become moist and lush with vegetations, which mostly happens after a heavy rainfall, in this environmental condition, the locust starts to gather together, and that sudden crowding triggers a hormone after which they start to transform into a different form. The locust starts to change both physically and mentally in this stage. They become bright yellow in color, their body starts to shrink, and interestingly, their brains become bigger. This phase of the locust called the gregarious phase. Locusts then breed and leave their eggs in the soil, and after the hatch they start gathering and hopping together as a unit. At this phase they start moving together as a unit. This is why Allah says in the Quran in Surah Qamar chapter 54 verse 7 that they will emerge from the grave as if they were locusts spreading. In this particular verse, Allah is referring to the day of judgment day when we will be resurrected from our graves. Allah is saying that on the judgment day we will be resurrected from our graves and we will be gathered together just like these locusts as a unit. So where we were, after they hatch they start gathering and moving together as a unit. At this time they do not have wings yet, but eventually they develop their wings and take off, and once they start flying it is almost impossible to stop them. They can travel up to 150 km a day. We don't have problems with the locusts of the solitary phase, but with the locusts of the gregarious phase. After transforming from the solitary phase to the gregarious phase, a drastic change comes to their eating habit. They can eat more food and more varieties of food. They can eat almost everything at this phase. So in this phase, they create their swarms and these swarms can destroy everything in their way. As I said, they can eat almost everything, almost every type of crops and fruits. And this is why wherever these swarms of locusts pass by, they can cause total destruction. And you should know that there can be more than 150 million locusts in a square kilometer. And in one day, one locust swarm can eat as much as 200 people can eat. You can imagine that how much destruction it can cause. Now let's get back to the topic. It is mentioned in the Quran chapter 7 verse 133 that Allah says, so we sent upon them the flood and locusts and lice and frog and blood as distinct signs, but they were arrogant and were criminal people. So who is Allah referring to in this verse? This very verse is referring to the people of Pharaoh, the king of the Egypt of the time. Allah showed them a lot of signs and yet they didn't accept Islam. They were still mocking and cursing Musa alayhi salam, Moses peace be upon him, and harming the Muslims. And so Allah then started showing them some difficult signs so that they can believe in the existence of Allah. Allah has mentioned the first of the difficult sign He showed to them in Surah Araf chapter 7 verse 130 that, "And we certainly seized the people of Pharaoh with years of famine and deficiency in fruits that perhaps they would be reminded." Allah caused the rain to stop for them, and even the Nile River started getting dry. And so there was scarcity of food for years in Egypt. There were no food for Pharaoh and his followers. So Pharaoh then understood that this is all happening because of Moses, peace be upon him. Pharaoh then walked to Moses and he told him that, "If you make a dua to your God and remove all these difficulties, I will release the Muslims and will never harm them." Musa alayhis salam agreed to this and made a dua to Allah, and everything went back to normal. But Pharaoh didn't keep his words and continued what he was doing. Allah says in chapter 7 verse 131 that, "But when good come to them, they said, 'This is ours,' and if a bad struck them, they saw an evil omen in Moses." He started saying that, as Allah says in the Quran, that Pharaoh said that, "No matter what sign you bring us, we will not believe in you." So after this incident, Allah sent flood to the Egypt from the river Nile. The flood Allah sent only did impact to the people of Pharaoh but not to the Muslims. They were clearly seeing this. Pharaoh again knew that this is because of Musa alayhis salam. So he went back to him and again asked him to make dua for them, giving the same promise. And when Allah removed the flood from them, he again didn't keep his promise and started doing what he was doing. This is when Allah sent locusts to them. Allah sent hundreds of thousands of locusts to them, which were destroying the crops and fruits of the people of Pharaoh. And I have already mentioned that how much destruction can locusts cause. The locusts ate all of the crops and fruits of the people of Pharaoh, but did nothing to Bani Israel. Allah protected the crops and the food for the Muslims. And again this time Pharaoh came to Musa and asked him to make a dua to Allah to fix it all. And Musa alayhis salam did it again. But again Pharaoh remained evil to Moses and his followers. Look how many times Allah gave them a chance, and yet they disbelieved. Allah then sent lice upon them. All of their hairs and all of their bed become covered with lice. Pharaoh again knows that this is because of Musa, so he again asks him to remove this plague. Musa alayhis salam again made dua for them, but again Pharaoh remained evil. After this incident, Allah then sent frog upon them. There were frogs all around Egypt. Their houses, their kitchen were full of frogs. And this time also Pharaoh asked Musa to ask Allah to remove this plague, but again he did the same thing. After the incident of frog, the incident of blood happened. The water of Pharaoh and his people started turning into blood. When the people of Pharaoh would try to fetch water from the river Nile or from a well, it would turn into blood. But when the Muslims would fetch water, it would remain the same. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stopped water from them. People of Pharaoh then walked to the Muslims and asked for water. But when they are given the water, it would again turn into blood. Look how many signs they have seen with their eyes, and yet they denied to accept Islam. This is why Allah is saying in the Quran that we sent so many signs upon them, the flood, the locust, the lice, the frog and the blood, but they were arrogant and were criminal people. This is after when the separation of the ocean happened. Pharaoh and his followers drowned to death. This is a complete tangent. We will talk about this incident someday in a separate video. But when Pharaoh was drowning, Allah says in the Quran in chapter 10 verse 90 that when drowning overtook him, he said, "I believe that there is no God except in whom the children of Israel believe, and I am of the Muslims." Allah says in the very next verse that, "Now you believe after disobeying me and being of the corruptors. Now you believe when you have seen your death with your eyes." Allah then said, "We shall now save your body so that you may serve as a sign of warning for the people." And wallahi, till this date, his body has been preserved in a museum in Egypt, so we could see the signs of Allah. But as Allah says, many of the people are heedless of his signs. Sorry for going to a complete tangent, but now you may have understood why Allah has mentioned locust in the Quran. Thank you so much, my dear brothers and sisters. I hope this video was helpful for you, and if so, make sure you hit the like button and do subscribe to this channel. And if you have any question to ask me in the comment section of this video, and inshallah will answer your question in the next video. Thank you.